Okay, so in this video, I'd like to discuss the kinds of functionality that I'd like in our final leg rig. Now, obviously, this kind of functionality in a production environment is going to be driven by the types of motion that our animation defines, along with the way in which our animator or animators like to work. In this case, I'm going to stipulate that the animators have looked at the motion that they need to animate, and they said, we only need IK for the legs. So let's just say that a walking type animation is required, something where we want to specify exactly where the foot is, but we don't need any more arc-like motions. We don't need any swinging of the legs, kicking footballs, and the likes. So we only need IK. We also had a request from our animator to say that he wants easy usable controls. Now that doesn't mean basic functionality. We still want to give him a lot of control. We just have to think about the interface for the animator and give them that control in a way that makes sense and in a way is very easy for them to use. So we're going to be defining and designing a leg rig that has quite a lot of functionality, but is very easy for an animator to access that functionality and to use the leg rig. We also need to recall that we're setting up our rig for both our goblin character, which is stretchy and more cartoony, and also for our skeleton, which acts in a more anatomically correct way, and it doesn't allow for stretchiness. So we're actually defining this rig for both our skeleton and our goblin, so we need to take into account the fact that we need to have the ability to have stretchiness, but also lock that stretchiness for when we're working with the skeleton and not with the goblin. So with that, let's jump over into the whiteboard and talk a little bit more about the leg rig that we're going to set up over the next few videos. So I'm going to jump over to the whiteboard and let's draw out a very basic leg. So let's draw out something like the goblin's leg, although we know that underneath this is indeed our skeleton leg. So we've got our goblin's leg coming down, something like so, and then he's got his foot on the end of the leg, something like so. Now, in terms of the leg, ignoring the foot for now, in terms of the leg, we know we can set up a leg in the basic sense with a 2-bone chain. That's a bone chain that goes from the hip, with a bone running from the hip down to the knee, and another bone running from the knee down to the ankle. So we could set up a 2-bone chain, and we want to drive this with IK. The animator has said he wants IK and not FK, so we can drive this with IK. So that means we're going to have an IK handle. Now we know that we want the ability for this to be stretchy for our goblin character, so this means that it would make sense for this to be stretchy IK. So this is going to be IK, and let's put in brackets that it can be stretchy. But if we want to use this rig for our skeleton as well, that means we need the ability to lock that stretchiness. So that stretchy needs to be lockable. So we're going to have stretchy IK, but we're going to provide a parameter that we can set, and that's going to lock the stretchiness so it goes back to becoming just normal IK and not stretchy IK. We also know that IK on its own isn't very useful unless we have control over the orientation of the plane in which the bones in the IK chain exist on. That means we need to be able to control the twist of our IK chain. Now, it would make sense to have some kind of rotational control to control the rotation of the bones, if you will, but to have that control sit out in front of the character. In fact, I want that control to sit out in front of the knee of the character. So that means I want some kind of rotational control that sits out in front of the character's knee. However, it wouldn't make much sense to rotate that control about its pivot point. Its pivot point would be sitting down the center of the control. That means if we make a rotation to this control, we know if we're rotating based on the twist of the IK, that rotation is actually going to take place about that axis there and not about the actual axis we're rotating about. It would look very odd indeed to be rotating, thinking we're rotating about one axis and seeing a result occur on a different axis. That means we need some way of offsetting that pivot point to the true pivot point of the twist rotation. We saw in the Inverse Kinematics DVD, that's Technical Rigging 3, we know that that pivot point for the twist occurs on the axis that goes from the top and the start of our bone chain down through to the end of our bone chain. So we have that axis going from the start to the end, and if we were to bring our pivot point back to the intercept on that axis, that would give us a pivot point where our rotation, if we rotate it about here, would give us the rotation about the same axis as the twist. Now, we are still going to have that control hovering out in front of our knee, and we're still going to select this control. This will be our twist control. But instead of rotating about its pivot, we're going to offset that pivot back to the intercept with the twist axis. So this is actually going to be the pivot point for the twist. So that's given us our IK, and it's given us our twist control. Now when we're working with stretchy IK, it would be nice to give the animator a little bit more control than just the stretchy IK that we've already set up with our stretchy IK tool. The stretchy IK tool comes in, and if we move the end effector past the length of the bone chain, it's going to stretch our bones to reach to the end effector. It'd be really nice if we could come in and change the length of the bones that's used to calculate whether they need to stretch or not. That means we could come in as an animator and have control over the upper leg and the lower leg individually using parameters. So we're going to allow for an upper stretch, which will change the length of the upper bone. And we're going to allow for a lower stretch, which will change the length of the lower leg bone, and that's going to allow us to work independently with the upper and lower leg, and whatever the result of the length of that bone chain is, that is then going to be used to drive whether we need to stretch based on the distance from our IK handle to the start of the bone chain based on our original stretchy IK. Now, of course, this is some kind of stretchy parameter, both the lower stretch and the upper stretch, so they too, along with our standard stretchy IK, need to be controlled by that lock that we are going to set up. So that's a look at the leg, but we know that we don't just have a leg, we have a foot, and this is going to bring up an interesting point because we're not actually going to give the animator control directly over this IK handle. We're actually going to embed the motion of that IK handle into our foot setup. So let's scroll down and let's draw out a very basic foot. So let's say that this was our lower leg bone coming down. From there we're going to have a foot bone, and from there we're going to have a bone that goes to the tip of our toes. So if we were to look at our leg, we'd have our leg coming down something like so. We'd have our lower leg down like so. We'd then come down into our ankle. This would be our foot. And our toes would come down right on the end of that bone. And that would be the bottom of our foot. So we're going to provide control over our foot with two bones, a foot bone and a toes bone. So that would be our foot bone and that would be our toes bone. But we're not going to simply provide FK control. That wouldn't make much sense. We know that we're dealing with IK with the leg, so it would make more sense to provide an IK-like control for the foot. So the main control for the foot is going to be our foot control, and it's going to look like a circle or a ring that sits around our foot. So if you just imagine that that does pass behind our foot and comes back round on the front, this is going to be our foot control. And this is going to provide the animator with overall control for our foot, and that's going to allow him to move the foot in all three axes, as well as rotate the foot about all three axes as well. And that is going to move and rotate from a pivot point that we're going to set just below the heel. So that means we rotate about the heel as well as moving the foot. Now in moving the foot, this is indirectly going to cause the movement of our ankle, so it will move the lower leg as well, and then our IK will take over. So we're going to move the entire foot as a whole, but we're also going to be moving our ankle based on the motion of that foot control. But that would give basic control over the foot, it would be nice to give just a little bit more control. So we're actually going to provide two roll controls. The first is going to be a ball roll. It's going to be a rotational control that sits about the end of our foot bone. And this is going to allow us to rotate, and that will rotate the foot bone about that pivot point. And that will, of course, move our ankle in an arc-like motion about that pivot point. So this is going to be our ball roll control. We're also going to provide a similar control right down on the tip of the toes. This is going to be our toe roll control. And that's again going to allow us to rotate, but in this case we're going to rotate the entire foot as a whole, bringing along both our toes bone, our foot bone, and our ankle, which is driving the IK chain, and that's all going to rotate about the point right on the tip of the foot. So that's going to be our toe roll control. So with that, we've taken a look at the functionality that we'd like our leg rig to have. We're going to have 4 controls: our foot control for defining the overall motion and orientation, if you will, of our foot, and that's going to obviously drive our leg. We're also going to have more fine control over the foot with both our ball roll and our toe roll controls. And we're going to have control over the orientation, the twist of our leg by using the twist control. So they're the 4 controls. Now this is just an overview of the types of functionality we will be setting up. Over the next few videos we'll create that functionality, and we'll discuss as we come up to each section in more detail how we're going to go about creating that functionality and how we're going to go about setting all of this up inside Houdini. But with that, that is a look at an overview of all the controls we're going to be setting up. So in the next video we'll start by creating the bones, and let's get all of this set up. Thanks a lot.